I'm also a convert to Islam. I didn't grow up Muslim. And I think about the ways in which many times religious conversion, and of course with Ali and anyone converting into the Nation of Islam, again, as Zaheer has so eloquently described here, it's an intertwined religious and political process. I think a lot of times we think about conversion as an event rather than a process. And, you know, you can make public declarations that your belief has changed, and to a certain extent that may be true, but the work that you do to undo and transform your behavior and thinking happens over a much longer and generally less visible period of time, right? And so perhaps some of that is at play there.
I think also, you know, the Nation of Islam was a vanguard movement. As a vanguard movement, they believed that they were at the forefront of woke consciousness. And so the expectations that you had of white people were not very high versus the expectations you had of black people, right? And so people who were not woke were considered treasonous, were considered betraying the rise of the liberation of the community. And so, you know, we're often targeted for even more. I mean, Malcolm did the same thing, you know, the way that he talked about, you know, Christian preachers and chicken-eating preachers and so forth and so on. It was, you know, part of that. You know, in the Nation of Islam, they called people who were not in the Nation of Islam lost founds. These were people who were lost and had yet to be found, right? Elijah Muhammad, you know, had like the so-called American Negro versus if you were in the nation, you were black or, you know, Asiatic black man or whatever, right? So I think there's the vanguard element where you see yourself at the forefront, and people who are not with you are, you know, subject to even greater scrutiny and criticisms in a way that people who you don't expect to be with you aren't.
Ali, of course, was the ultimate. Sorry.
Also, Ali was concerned with the gate. So he's saying was shown. So what you said is absolutely correct. Psychologically, so he wanted to show that those who don't embrace the Nation of Islam, you know, so it needs to be shown up. And he was showing also that when it came down to getting in front of the audience and fighting, that they wanted to make sure that they can take from that gate as much as possible. He said, so, you know, don't worry about what I'm saying to you. Just, you know, consider what's going to happen after the fact. How you're going to line your pockets with the money that I'm making. He was just showing me that. So it's both psychological and a marketing tool.
Any other questions or comments?
So I guess I just wanted to
stand up.
I guess I just wanted to complicate what's been the conversation that's being had. So I basically wanted to ask about racism within the Muslim community itself. So how converts are often delegitimized, or Black Muslims aren't often seen as legitimized as Muslims who may be Arab or of other descent. So I was just wondering how the legacy of Muhammad Ali could possibly be used to sort of address the racism within the Muslim community itself, and basically just complicating the conversation in general.
Well, interestingly, I think that one of the problems with what I've seen as far as this issue is concerned within conversations, internal Muslim community conversations and discourses around Muhammad Ali. Is for me, there's personally a lot of frustration with the way that Muhammad Ali is taken up as a symbol, but he's, but not really his, and embraced in that way, but his blackness, or at least the blackness of others who also have that characteristic, is not equally valorized. In other words, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, I think I would say, for U.S. Muslims, are two, for obviously very good reasons, incredible symbols of, and symbols upon which a lot of people hang their own, like they hitch their wagons to. So their legitimacy as American citizens, or as culturally belonging to America, is done on the persons of Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. So these legacies are claimed, but meanwhile, you don't think a black person is good enough to marry, or you don't think black Muslims can really be legitimate spokespeople for the religion, that they're not as knowledgeable. I mean, all of the kind of things that, that you've described. And I think, and this is something that I've spoken against a lot. Is that, if we are going to, and I would also say with that, particularly within the context of both Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X's trajectory, because in some ways, they're similar. They start off in the Nation of Islam, which according to most, the broader body of Muslims numerically, right, is unorthodox, heterodox, not real Islam. They're not Muslims, right? But then both of them at later points in their lives become Sunni Muslims. They become Orthodox. And so then there's all of this language about transcending, right? They've transcended that erroneous understanding of Islam, which is linked to blackness, because it's erroneous and it's illegitimate because of the way that it places blackness at the center of it. And because black people practice it. And so it can't be real Islam. But of course, we're going to claim Muhammad Ali as our own, right? So this is a problem, right? And I think that we have to have real honest conversations about kind of what's going on here, and what these symbols become a cover for. I think this conversation about appropriation culturally, right, and it's not limited to the Muslim community, but of course it takes place when we're talking about, for example, the Kardashians or whatever, right? Where, many people have said, well, like they love black culture, but not black people, right? I think you have some of that happens frequently around the person of Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X within the context of the Muslim community in the U.S., which is probably the most diverse collection of Muslims on the planet, right? There's something like 80 nationalities and ethnicities, right? All types of sectarian affiliations, class, gender, race, language, whatever. But it's really interesting the ways that that the Islam and religiously, these two figures are also many times the discourse around them is that that when they transcended race, right? This is when they became legitimate Muslims, right? But when they left all that black stuff behind, all of that complaining about racism, all of that like demonization of white supremacy, which is not synonymous necessarily with the demonization of white people. Then, and this is some of the same conversations, and as Zaheer mentioned in the opening, that I had publicly about the legacy of Muhammad Ali, because everyone was eager to claim Muhammad Ali the Olympic torchbearer. Well, because he but they didn't want to acknowledge, they didn't want to respect the fact that the things that they were praising him for came out of his days in the Nation of Islam. This is where his legacy was forged, right? And there were a lot of things that he went on to do after that experience, but that's where it was birthed. When he stood up against the Vietnam War, he was coming from the message to the black man. These were the words of Elijah Muhammad that motivated him to take that particular political position. And so then when we come along and we say, well, he got past all of that, right? And I'm not a member of the Nation of Islam, but let's be historically accurate, and let's talk about what transcendence is a gloss for, right? What it is that we're trying to get past, and what is it that we're trying to forget that we never really properly acknowledged in the first place.
I don't really have anything like that. I'll just say, there's a lot that can be done to address the problem that exists in the Muslim communities around the issue of race, and it's one of the reasons why I like the story of how he defeated, or how the overturning happened of the Supreme Court case. That it is rooted in the writings of Elijah Muhammad. It is an African American Muslim. Whether or not you identify him as such, he identified himself that way. So I'm going to get into historical basis, not the theological basis for his identity. So, that, and I think it's just not letting people use the history to erase race, right? That, race is a present script in Christianity, and it is a present script in Islam. Theologically, we can say we don't have that, we're not supposed to have that, but historically, race has functioned, right? I mean, when Malcolm went to Saudi Arabia, his second, in 64, there's these passages in the autobiography where he's meeting with the king, and a servant walks in and out of the room, but he doesn't really comment on who that servant is, but we can guess, because that country was so late in abolishing slavery, well into the 20th century, right? And so these are the subtexts, right, of the quote unquote colorblind Muslim world. And I think not letting people get away with pulling that history, bamboozling us, as Malcolm would say, with that fake history.
All right, we have time for one question because we have some refreshments here. We also want to leave time for Jonathan to meet you all and to sign books outside. So we'll take one more question and the rest of the conversation can continue after. Yes, sir.
Yes, I believe in 1990, Muhammad Ali went to Iraq to negotiate with Saddam Hussein to release some Western hostages. But while he was there as a Sunni Muslim, he went to sites that were very sacred to Shiites. So he played a huge ecumenical role as a Sunni Muslim. So can you please speak more on how he navigated inter-Muslim issues and what his role was?
I don't really know much about that trip. I do know that Ali felt like he could do whatever he wanted, that the people would let him get away with anything, and that he was never concerned with issues of propriety or borders, and he believed that he was here for all people, which is why he was able to perform some of these acts of diplomacy, which is why presidents would send him to places like Iraq and Iran to try to get hostages released. And he was often just a horrible diplomat. They sent him to Africa to try to build support for the Olympic boycott, for the Moscow Olympics. And as soon as he landed, these African leaders would say, well, Mr. Ali, we get a lot of support from Russia, but they help us with far more money than the U.S. does. So how can we boycott the Olympics? And Ali said, you're right. You got to go to the Olympics. And, he was very impressionable, but that was also a part of why he was so beloved. And I don't know, maybe someone here knows more about that particular visit, but I do know that he was never concerned with issues of etiquette like that. He believed everyone was going to love him everywhere he went, and most of the time he was right.
I'll just say, historically, the kind of sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia has not manifested itself in the United States that way. One of the earliest communities to be very successful in teaching Islam in the African American community was the Ahmadiyyas, who are outlawed in Pakistan, right? you had a Shia African American, Sunni African Americans, and I would say on the ground there, even with NOI folk, like there's intermingling. You know, the project I'm looking at, Muslims in Brooklyn, there are people who like went to each different mosque depending on what they felt like on a given Friday, and never like acknowledged those kinds of differences. I don't think it's not until the 90s when the Saudis really step up the missionary work of the kind of Wahhabist interpretation of Islam that you see the rise of Salafi, which is I would say a hyper-Orthodox tradition in the African American, and in those communities you'll find the kind of sectarians, but historically you haven't found that.
We want to thank our panels, Zaheer Ali, Donna Auston, and of course Jonathan A for this remarkable book. We want to thank Zaheer for inviting us and convening this. I don't know if you have some final words you want to bestow upon us.
I just want to offer my words of gratitude to Josh and Zaheer and Donna and Jonathan for being here, and for all of you for coming out and reflecting on the life and legacy of Muhammad Ali. We want the conversation to continue, so we have some refreshments for you all to hang out and eat together and continue thinking about it. We have other events planned for the semester. If you join our email list outside, you can keep abreast of those events. One of the events that I want to highlight in particular is that we have an event in April, at the very beginning of April, I think it's April 1st or 2nd, on a Muslim theologian's response to violence in God's name. And there's somebody by the name of Dr. Sheikh Yasir Qadhi, who is an interesting figure in the Muslim American community, who will be coming and speaking on that. And it's a Princeton Public Lectures is co-sponsoring that. So come out for that, join the email list, keep in touch, and have a wonderful evening. Take good care of yourselves and give a warm applause to this wonderful family. And buy Jonathan's book. Buy Jonathan's book. It's $30. You can get your copy outside, and Jonathan will be very, very happy to sign it for you. Thank you.